The stagecoach groaned to a halt, its wheels sighing into the silence of a world painted in red. For a moment, the dust it had churned hung in the afternoon air like a veil, thick and coppery, before settling back onto everything, onto the weathered faces of the buildings, onto the sweat-stained flanks of the horses, and onto the fine black wool of the dress worn by the coach's sole remaining passenger. Mary stepped down, her city boots sinking into a powder so fine it felt like stepping into nothing at all. She clutched a small, worn valise to her chest, the only thing in this vast, raw country that was truly hers. The dust immediately claimed her, clinging to the hem of her travel-worn skirt, dusting her dark eyelashes, settling into the lines of fatigue around her mouth. She took a breath and tasted grit. This was Border Ridge, Colorado, the end of the line, and perhaps the beginning of one. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the single, wide street. It was less a town and more a temporary argument with the wilderness. False-fronted buildings, a general store, a smithy, a saloon bellowing tinny piano music even in the daylight lined the thoroughfare, looking as if they'd been dropped there and told to survive. Men in dusty hats paused their conversations to watch her, their gazes lingering, heavy with appraisal. She felt their eyes like a physical touch, cataloging her a woman, alone, with the kind of clothes that didn't belong and the kind of weariness that told a story they were all too eager to write for themselves. She unconsciously touched a spot on her temple, where the faint, yellowing shadow of a bruise hid beneath her hairline. A memento from the life she had escaped, a life she would sooner die than return to. Squaring her shoulders, she forced one foot in front of the other, her destination the blocky form of Henderson's Mercantile and Dry Goods. The bell above the door announced her entry with a cheerful, discordant jangle. The air inside was cool and smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and lye soap. A stout man with a magnificent gray mustache and suspicious eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" he asked. His tone wasn't welcoming. "Yes, sir," Mary said, her voice steadier than she felt. It was a voice schooled in Baltimore drawing rooms, clear and precise, and it sounded alien here. "I'm looking for employment. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, mend." The man, Henderson, wiped the polished countertop with a rag that had seen better days. He didn't look at her, but at a point just over her shoulder, as if addressing a ghost. "This ain't a place for that. Not for your kind." "My kind," Mary's chin lifted. "I'm not sure I understand." "A woman. Alone," he said flatly, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were small and hard as river stones. "There's only one kind of establishment in Border Ridge that hires women without a husband or a father to speak for 'em." He jerked his chin toward the street, in the direction of the raucous piano music, the Dusty Spur Saloon. "They might have a place for you." The insult was a slap, sharp and stinging. He was not suggesting she serve drinks. Heat flooded Mary's cheeks, a painful, humiliating blush. To be cast in such a light, to have her desperation mistaken for depravity, was a cruelty she hadn't prepared for. She had faced a man's temper and his fists, but this casual dismissal of her worth by a stranger felt like a different kind of violence. "Thank you for your time, sir," she said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. She turned and walked out, the man's smug satisfaction a palpable force at her back. Outside, the sun seemed harsher, the stares of the men more predatory. The piano music from the saloon felt like a taunt. She was trapped. Her money was nearly gone, spent on the long, rattling journey west. She had fled one cage only to find herself in another, larger one, with no walls but just as inescapable. She was standing there, a solitary figure adrift in a sea of red dust and hostile glances. When three men detached themselves from the saloon's porch, they were drunk. It was clear from their lurching gaits and overloud laughter. They saw her, and their expressions shifted from boozy mirth to a focused, predatory interest. "Well now, look what the stage brought in," one of them slurred. a big man with a stained beard and a wide, unpleasant grin. He planted himself in her path, a little swallow, blown way off course. His two companions fanned out, blocking any retreat. Mary's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. She clutched her valise tighter. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Oh, she's a polite one," the second man crowed. He was thin and weaselly, with shifty eyes. "Where you headed in such a hurry? Miss ain't no place for a lady to be all alone." "She ain't a lady," the first one grunted, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Henderson told her where she belongs. He took a shuffling step closer. "We can show you the way, give you a real Border Ridge welcome." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This was it. This was the moment her desperate flight for freedom ended in a dusty alley, a grim story to be whispered over whiskey glasses. She took a step back, her heel hitting the edge of the boardwalk. Trapped. "That's enough." The voice was low and flat, devoid of emotion, yet it cut through the drunken haze like a shard of ice. It came from a man who had seemingly materialized from the shadows of the smithy across the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, worn denim and leather. A dark hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape around them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw the Colt holstered low on his hip. He simply stood there, a figure of absolute stillness, his presence a silent, deadly promise. The three drunks turned. The bravado drained from the leader's face, replaced by a flicker of fear and recognition. "Grady," he mumbled. "We was just having a bit of fun." "Your fun is over," the man, Grady, said. His eyes, the color of weathered slate, moved from the drunks to Mary, taking in her pale face and the desperate grip she had on her bag. It was a quick, assessing glance, and then his attention was back on the men. "Move along." It wasn't a request. It was a command backed by an authority that had nothing to do with a badge. The drunks grumbled, shooting resentful glances at Mary, but they obeyed. They shuffled past, melting back toward the saloon that had spawned them. Silence descended again, broken only by the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. The man named Grady stood there for a moment, ensuring the threat was gone. Mary found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "Thank you." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze was unsettling. It wasn't leering like the others, but it was just as intense, as if he were looking straight through her, weighing and measuring her. He had the eyes of a man who had seen too much and expected the worst. "You shouldn't be here alone," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, the confession costing her a piece of her dwindling pride. "I am looking for work, honest work." She looked at him directly, letting him see the desperation but also the resolve in her gaze. "Do you know of any—" His expression didn't change. No. The single word was final. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over her. Of course not. Why would this grim stranger be any different from the storekeeper she was about to turn away, to face the impossible choice between the saloon and starvation? When he spoke again, "My place," he said, the words seemingly pulled from him against his will. "Up on the mountain. It's been empty. Needs cleaning, dusting out the ghosts." A flicker of some deep, old pain crossed his features before being locked away again. "I'll give you 1 week's work. Pay you enough to get a ticket on the next stagecoach east. Or west, I don't care which." Hope, fragile and tentative, fluttered in her chest. A week of safety, a roof over her head, and enough money to move on. It was more than she had dared to pray for. "I accept," she said quickly, before he could change his mind. "When do we leave?" "Now," he said, turning toward a sturdy horse tied in front of the smithy, "before this town eats you alive." The journey up the mountain was a silent one. Mary rode a gentle mare he procured from the livery, her small valise tied behind her saddle. Weston Grady rode ahead, his back a rigid, uncommunicative wall. He moved with an easy, practiced grace, a man perfectly at home in the saddle and in the wilderness. As they climbed, the red dust of the plains gave way to the richer soil of the foothills. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The wind, which had been a hot breath on the flats, became a mournful whisper through the towering ponderosa pines that lined the trail. The world shrank to the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the vast, intimidating silence of the mountains. Mary watched him, studying the man who was her reluctant savior. He was a paradox of stillness and readiness. His hands rested easily on his reins, but his gaze was constantly moving, scanning the tree line, the rocky outcrops, the sky. He was a man living on a knife's edge, though she couldn't guess what dangers he was watching for. He wasn't a talker. When she'd asked if the mare had a name, he'd simply replied, "Horse." When she'd commented on the beauty of a distant, snow-capped peak, he'd only grunted in acknowledgement. Yet, in his silence, there was a strange sort of comfort. It was an honest silence, not the judgmental quiet of the town. He had offered her a transaction, a simple exchange of labor for wages, with no hidden meaning or sordid expectation. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a sliver of something that resembled safety. It was a fragile thing, this trust between two strangers, born of shared isolation rather than shared words. But it was there. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. When they finally broke through a thick stand of aspen, ahead, nestled against the protective shoulder of the mountain, was a small, sturdily built log cabin with a stone chimney. A barn and a corral stood nearby. It was a lonely place, a bastion against the immense wilderness that stretched in every direction. It looked solid, enduring, but also profoundly neglected. Weeds grew high around the foundation, and the windows were dark and blank, like vacant eyes. Weston dismounted in one fluid motion and came to help her down. His hands were rough and calloused as they briefly circled her waist, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. He lit a lantern he took from a hook by the door, the hiss and flare of the match loud in the evening quiet. He pushed the heavy wooden door open. It swung inward with a low groan, stirring the air inside. A wave of cold, stale air washed over them, carrying the scent of dust, cold ashes, and something else, a faint, lingering hint of wood smoke and sorrow. He stepped across the threshold, holding the lantern high. The golden light spilled into the darkness, illuminating a blizzard of dust motes dancing in the beam. It revealed a room frozen in time, a simple table and 2 chairs, a stone hearth, black with soot, a rocking chair, perfectly still. Everything was coated in a thick, gray blanket of dust, the shroud of a long-abandoned life. Mary hesitated at the doorway, peering into the dusty gloom. This was his home, a home he had called empty, a place of ghosts. It felt like standing at the entrance to a tomb. Weston looked back at her, his face half hidden in the shadows cast by the lantern. The harsh lines seemed to soften, and for a fleeting second, his slate-gray eyes held a profound, bottomless weariness. "Welcome," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, thick with an irony that held no humor at all, "to the middle of nowhere." The first day was a battle waged with a broom, a bucket of water, and a stack of old rags. Mary worked with a methodical fury, treating the dust not as dirt, but as an oppressive presence that had to be evicted. She started with the main room, her battlefield. She swept the thick, felt-like layers from the floorboards, the dust bunnies scattering like frightened mice. She scrubbed the long, cold ashes from the stone hearth, her arms aching with the effort. As she worked, she began to uncover the house's true character, buried beneath the gray shroud of neglect. The floorboards were wide-planked pine, scarred and worn but solid. The furniture was simple, handmade, and strong. This was a house built to endure, not to impress. It had been a home. In the small pantry, behind a row of empty tins, she found it. A single glass jar of preserves, its contents a dark, rich purple. A small, neat label was tied to its neck with a piece of twine. The handwriting was delicate, a woman's hand. It read, Saskatoon Berry Jam. August 1873. 3 years ago. Mary ran a finger over the date. August, a time of warmth, of sunshine and harvest. She imagined a woman standing in this very spot, her hands stained with berry juice, carefully sealing a piece of summer away for the cold months to come. A ghost's pantry. She set the jar on the freshly wiped shelf. A small, vibrant monument to a life interrupted. Weston remained a distant, silent presence. He spent the day outside, his movements economical and purposeful. He mended a broken rail on the corral, reshod one of the horses, and split a small mountain of firewood. Mary watched him from the window as she cleaned. She noticed his peculiar habit then, whether he was at the chopping block or tightening a cinch on his saddle. He never stood with his back to an open space. He was always positioned against the solid wall of the barn, or the cabin, or a thick stand of trees. He faced the world as if expecting an attack, his body angled to see the approaches, never the door. It wasn't the caution of a lawman, but the ingrained reflex of a man who had been ambushed by fate itself, a man whose world had gone up in flames from behind. Late in the afternoon, her work in the main room almost done, Mary found herself standing before a closed door at the far end of the cabin. It was the only other room besides the pantry. Curiosity and a need to know the full geography of her temporary shelter pulled her forward. She rested her hand on the simple iron latch. It was cold to the touch. She pushed the door open a few inches and peered inside. It was a bedroom. The air was even more still, more heavy with the past than the main room had been. A simple wooden bedstead stood against the far wall, covered with a beautiful, intricate quilt of blue and white squares. On a small nightstand, a book lay face down, its place marked forever. A woman's silver-backed brush and comb set rested on a small dresser, waiting for a hand that would never return. This room had not been neglected. It had been preserved. It was a shrine. A sudden, piercing sense of trespass made her pull the door closed with a soft click. This was not her space to disturb. This was Maggie's room. She hadn't heard the name, but she knew it in her bones. This was the heart of the house's sorrow. That night, she laid a bedroll of spare blankets Weston had given her from a storage chest, placing it on the floor before the great stone hearth. He had built a fire, and the flames leaped and danced, casting warm, flickering shadows that made the room feel alive again. They ate in near silence. A simple meal of bacon and beans he'd cooked in a skillet over the flames. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared quiet, a respite from a world that was too loud with judgment and demands. When the meal was over, he sat in his straight-backed chair, staring into the fire. Mary sat on her blankets, nursing a tin cup of hot, black coffee. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "You've done good work," Weston said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the floorboards. "The place, it breathes again." "It's a good house," she replied softly. "A strong house." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the flames. "I built it for her, for Maggie, my wife." He said the name as if it were a fragile piece of glass. She loved this mountain. Mary remained quiet, sensing that this was a threshold. He was either going to retreat back into his silence or step across into confession. "The fire," he began, his voice rough with unshed grief. "It started in the barn. A lantern, maybe a spark in the hay. The wind was up that night, a mean wind from the north. I was miles away, checking the fence line up on the ridge. By the time I saw the glow in the sky, It was too late. He paused, and the crackle of the fire filled the void. He didn't need to describe the rest. The horror of it was etched on his face, in the permanent tension around his eyes and mouth. "She was in the house, with our boy, Sam." His voice broke on the name, a single, sharp crack in his stony facade. "He was only 4. They said it was the smoke, that it was fast. That's what the sheriff told me." He finally looked at Mary, and his eyes were hollowed-out caverns of guilt and pain. "I wasn't here. A man is supposed to protect his family. I was checking a damn fence." The raw agony in his voice was a physical thing. Mary felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She saw a pain that mirrored her own, not in its circumstances, but in its depth, the feeling of being powerless, of being failed by the one person who was supposed to be your protector. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there is nothing you can do. Sometimes the fire is too big." He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a job to be done or a problem to be managed, but as a person. "And what fire were you running from?" "Mary," he asked, using her name for the first time. She took a shaky breath. "A man. His name is Harrison Blackwood. My father arranged a marriage. He's a wealthy man, an important man, and he believes that what he buys, he owns, including his wife." She didn't speak of the specifics, the hard grip on her arm that left bruises, the cold fury in his eyes when she expressed an opinion he didn't share, the terrifying quiet that always preceded his temper. Instead, she described the cage. He had a way of making you feel like a pretty bird he kept in a gilded cage. He wanted you to sing when he commanded, and be silent when he wished for quiet. And if the bird ever beat its wings against the bars, he would remind it how small the cage was, how there was nowhere else to go. She looked down at her hands, twisting the tin cup. My father saw it as a fine match, security, position. He didn't see the bars, or perhaps he did, and simply didn't care. She finally met Weston's gaze. So I fled. Before the wedding, before he could lock the door for good, I stole my own life back. In the firelight, 2 solitary souls, each scarred by their own kind of fire, shared a moment of profound, unadorned honesty. They were no longer just a rancher and his temporary help. They were survivors. The next morning, Mary woke to a house filled with a soft, gray light. She rose from her blankets and looked out the window. A delicate layer of frost coated the world, sparkling on the pine needles and outlining every blade of grass in silver. The air was crisp and clean, a world washed new. Her week was almost up. The idea of leaving, of taking her wages and descending back into the dust and uncertainty of Border Ridge, filled her with a new kind of dread. Here, in this house of sorrow, she had found a strange peace. Here, she was not judged. Here, she was useful. Weston was already outside, tending to the horses. She built up the fire and put the coffee on to boil. As she moved about the room, she found herself thinking of it not as the cabin, but as her kitchen, her hearth. The skillet she'd scoured clean was the good skillet. The blankets she'd aired out belonged in the pine chest. It was a quiet, unconscious act of claiming, of putting down the shallowest of roots. She decided, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would ask to stay another week. Her gaze fell on the closed bedroom door. Behind it lay the past, a life perfectly preserved in dust and memory, a shrine to a ghost. She thought of Maggie, the woman of the Saskatoon jam and the beautiful quilt, and felt a pang of sympathy, not pity. She thought of Weston, living his life with his back to the door, a prisoner of a single, terrible moment. She walked to the door and placed her hand on the latch. This time, it did not feel so cold. She could spend another week, another month, sleeping on the floor, a guest in someone else's tragedy. She could honor the ghosts by keeping her distance, by treating this house like a museum, or she could choose to live in it. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern ridge. sending the first golden rays of dawn through the window. The frost began to melt, dripping like tiny tears from the eaves. A new day, a choice. With a deep breath, Mary pushed the door open. The light followed her in, pouring into the shadowed room, illuminating the dust motes that danced over the quilted bed. She would be gentle. She would be respectful. She would not try to erase the woman who had lived and loved in this room, but she would not be another shadow in this house. She would air out the blankets, polish the silver brush, and sleep in the bed. She would respect the memory of the dead, but for herself, and for the living man outside, she would choose life. The second week bled into a third, and the rhythm of life on the mountain settled into a quiet, steady cadence. Mary had woken the house from its long slumber, and in return, it had given her a sanctuary. The scent of baking bread now mingled with the ever-present aroma of pine. Curtains she had fashioned from bleached flour sacks softened the harsh afternoon light. Weston had even, on 2 separate occasions, been caught in the act of something that looked remarkably like a smile. A fragile domesticity was taking root in the rocky soil, a tender green shoot in a landscape of old sorrows. They worked in comfortable silence, an unspoken understanding flowing between them. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the porch in the morning. She would have a hot meal waiting for him when he came in from the fields at dusk, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He was still a man walled off by his past, but she began to see small cracks in the stone. He started talking about the ranch, his plans to breed a hardier line of cattle, his respect for the unforgiving beauty of the land. He spoke of the future, a concept he seemed to be cautiously reacquainting himself with. The outside world, with its dust and judgment, felt 1,000 miles away, until the day it came riding up their trail. It was late afternoon. Mary was tending a small herb garden she had cleared near the cabin, her hands deep in the rich, dark earth, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. It was too early for Weston to be back from the high pasture. She straightened up, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. They were not ranchers. They were slab-sided, hard-faced men with rifles resting in their saddle scabbards and greedy, assessing eyes. Their clothes were functional but unkempt, their gear worn from long, hard travel. They moved with a slouching arrogance, men who made their living on the misfortunes of others. Weston appeared as if summoned by the threat itself. He stepped out of the barn, a heavy wrench in one hand, his body instantly taut with a dangerous stillness. He positioned himself between the riders and the cabin, a silent, immovable guardian. Looking for something, Weston's voice was flat, carrying easily in the clear mountain air. The larger of the 2 men, a brute with a tangled beard and a scar that cut through one eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Weston's boots. Maybe, "We're looking for property that's gone missing from its rightful owner back east. A piece of property answers to the name of Whitmore." Mary's blood ran cold. She froze, her trowel falling from her numb fingers. They had found her. The cage she had fled had sent its keepers. "There's no one here by that name," Weston said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming as cold and hard as river ice. "This is Grady land. You're trespassing." The second man, smaller and more weasel-like, chuckled without humor. "There's a reward, a handsome one, $500 for her return. Seems this property is quite valuable." His eyes slid past Weston, fixing on Mary. He licked his thin lips. "And there she is. Looks like the reward is ours for the taking." The big man started to dismount, a confident smirk on his face. "We have a contract, signed and sealed. We're authorized to bring her back." "You're not authorized to do anything on my land," Weston said. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised the wrench, but the raw menace radiating from him was more potent than any weapon. The name, Grady, spoken in this place by this man, carried a weight the bounty hunters were beginning to appreciate. He was not some simple homesteader to be pushed around. "I suggest you get back on your horses and ride back down the way you came. And don't come back." The bounty hunter hesitated, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. He looked at Weston's unblinking, slate-gray eyes and saw no fear, no compromise. He saw a man who had already lost everything, and such a man was the most dangerous kind. He saw the wrench in Weston's hand and knew it would cave in his skull before he could even clear leather. He glanced at his partner, who gave a slight shake of his head. This wasn't worth it. Not for $500. "This ain't over. Grady," the big man snarled as he swung back into his saddle. "We'll be back, with a federal marshal and a warrant that says we can go wherever we please." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their departure leaving a ringing silence in their wake. The moment they were gone, the strength drained from Mary's limbs. She stumbled back against the cabin wall, gasping for air. Panic, the old, familiar enemy, was a cold serpent coiling in her gut. "They'll come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Weston, you don't understand. The betrothal, it's a legal contract. My father signed it. Harrison can use the law to claim me. He can have me dragged back there in chains, and it will all be perfectly legal." That night, the easy silence between them was gone, replaced by a tense, worried quiet. Mary paced the floor, her mind a whirlwind of fear. She had brought this danger to his door. This good, quiet man who had offered her shelter was now in the crosshairs because of her. "I have to leave," she said finally, stopping in front of him where he sat staring into the fire. "Before they come back with the law." Weston looked up at her, his face grim in the firelight. "And go where back to Border Ridge? You saw what that place is. You won't last a day. Running isn't a plan. Mary, it's just running." He stood up and went to a large, dust-covered wooden chest in the corner, a chest she had never seen him open. He lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of old paper and cedar filled the room. He rummaged inside for a moment before pulling out a small, leather-bound portfolio. He brought it to the table and untied the laces. Inside was a collection of old, yellowed documents. He carefully extracted a birth certificate, a baptismal record, and a handful of faded letters. He pushed them across the table toward her. "Read the name," he said. She picked up the birth certificate. The script was ornate. The ink faded to brown. "Mary Thompson." She read aloud. "Born in St. Louis, Missouri, 1852. My mother's cousin," Weston explained, his voice low. "She died of a fever when she was a girl. The family kept her papers. Out here, a piece of paper can be anything you need it to be, as long as no one can prove it's a lie." He looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "Mary Whitmore is a piece of property with a bounty on her head. Mary Thompson is my cousin from Missouri. Come out to help me with the ranch after my loss. She's kin, and folks around here are slow to meddle with a man's kin." She stared at the documents, her heart pounding. A new name, a new history, a shield. It was a lie, a dangerous one, but it was also a lifeline. The right to choose her own name. It was a freedom she had never imagined. "Weston," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "It's your choice," he said, "but if you stay as Mary Thompson." A few days later, another rider came up the trail. This one was alone, and he rode with an easy, confident air. He wore a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Tom Burns. He was a man in his late 30s, with a sun-weathered face and intelligent, discerning eyes. He wasn't the kind of man you could easily fool. He dismounted and nodded to Weston. "Grady." "Sheriff," Weston acknowledged, his stance relaxed but wary. Burns's gaze drifted to Mary, who stood on the porch, her hands wrapped in her apron. "Town's been buzzing. Weston, folks say you've got a woman up here." "This is my cousin, Mary Thompson," Weston said smoothly, his voice betraying no hint of deception. "She's come to help out for a spell." Sheriff Burns looked at Mary for a long, silent moment. His eyes took in her fine-boned features, the hands that were still too soft for a farm girl, and the lingering shadow of fear in her eyes. He was a man who knew how to read people. "Thompson, you say?" He tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am." He turned his attention back to Weston. "I'll be plain with you. Grady, 2 bounty hunters came through my office yesterday. They were waving around some fancy-looking legal papers from back east about a runaway fiancé. I sent them packing. Their jurisdiction doesn't mean much in this county without my say-so." Relief washed over Mary so intensely she felt dizzy. "But," Burns continued, his voice firm, "if they come back with a federal warrant, my hands will be tied. I wear this star, and I uphold the law. I don't always like the law, but I uphold it." He looked from Weston to Mary and back again. "Just so we're clear, in this territory, the law and what's right are 2 different trails that don't always lead to the same place. I'm just letting you know where my trail has to go." He mounted his horse, gave them a final, meaningful look, and rode away. His visit was both a reprieve and a stark warning. The shield of paper was not enough. The law could still be turned against them. That evening, as Weston cleaned his rifle by the fire, Mary made a decision. She would not be a damsel hiding behind a false name. She would not put the entire burden of her protection on his shoulders. "Teach me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked up, pausing his work. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot," she said. "If they come back, if anyone comes back, I won't be helpless. I won't be a liability. I need to know how to defend myself. This home." He studied her face, seeing the fear but also the iron resolve hardening within it. He gave a slow nod. The next afternoon, he took her to a clearing behind the barn. He set up an old tin can on a fence post. He didn't give her his heavy Colt. Instead, he brought out a smaller, more elegant pistol with a pearl handle. It was Maggie's. He said simply, she believed a woman on the frontier should be able to protect her own. The weight of the gun in her hand was both terrifying and empowering. Weston stood behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He adjusted her stance, showed her how to align the sights, his large, calloused hands gently guiding hers. "Breathe out slow," he instructed, his voice low in her ear. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." The first shot was deafening. It kicked hard in her hand, and the bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet from the target, but she didn't drop the gun. She took a deep, steadying breath and listened as he corrected her grip. Again, she fired, and again. She was no longer Mary Whitmore, the Baltimore belle who fainted at loud noises. She was Mary Thompson, a woman of the mountains, and her voice was the crack of a pistol, a sharp declaration of her will to survive. A week later, the circuit mail rider made his monthly trek up the mountain. He brought supplies from the mercantile in a single and crisp envelope. It was addressed simply to the occupant, Grady Ranch. Weston took it, his expression hardening as he saw the expensive paper and the elegant, forceful handwriting. He handed it to Mary. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. It was from her father, but the words, the cold, venomous threats, were pure Harrison Blackwood. It was an ultimatum. She was to return to Baltimore by the first heavy snow, or Harrison would use his considerable wealth and influence to see her brought back as a common fugitive. But there was more. The letter ended with a chilling postscript. Asterisk. Should you refuse, be assured that your rustic protector will face consequences of his own. We have been made aware of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding the fire that claimed his first family. A thorough investigation, funded by parties interested in the truth, could easily uncover negligence, or perhaps something more deliberate. A man with so much to lose should be careful who he shelters. Mary looked up from the letter, her face ashen. They were not just coming for her anymore. They were going to use Weston's greatest tragedy, his deepest wound, as a weapon to destroy him. Her fight for freedom had just become a fight for his life. The letter lay on the mantelpiece, a pale and venomous snake coiled in the heart of their home. Its presence changed everything. The quiet companionship that had grown between them was now stretched taut, vibrating with a constant, low hum of dread. Every gust of wind in the pines sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow in the twilight seemed to harbor a threat. Winter was gathering its strength in the high peaks, and with it, Harrison Blackwood's deadline approached. Weston grew even more withdrawn, his silence now heavier, colder. He spent his days working with a grim, relentless energy, but his eyes were always scanning the perimeter. He was a sentinel guarding a fortress under siege. Mary's fear, once a wild, panicked thing, began to temper into something harder, sharper. She practiced with Maggie's pistol every single day. The ritual, a meditation of defiance. The recoil no longer startled her. The scent of gunpowder became the smell of resolve. She learned to reload with steady hands, her movements becoming more fluid, more certain. She was forging a new version of herself in the crucible of her fear. The attack came on a Tuesday, in the gloaming. The sun had slipped behind the western ridge, bleeding the last of its color from the sky. A deep purple dusk settled over the valley, blurring the edges of the world. Weston was out, making his final, grim patrol of the property line, a ritual he'd started the day the letter arrived. Mary was alone in the cabin, the warm glow of the lantern pushing back against the encroaching darkness. She had just slid the heavy bar across the newly reinforced door when she heard the whisper of movement outside, a stealthy crunch of pine needles that was not Weston's familiar tread. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, straining her ears, every nerve ending alive. Then came the unmistakable sound of a body slamming against the door. The thick wood shuddered in its frame, the bar groaning in protest. They weren't bounty hunters this time. Not the loud, clumsy drunks from before. These were predators. Another heavy thud, harder this time. A crack spiderwebbed across one of the planks. Panic, cold and electric, shot through her veins, but something else rose with it, the echo of Weston's calm voice. Asterisk, squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. The memory of the gun's solid weight in her hand. Her movements were swift, almost instinctual. She backed away from the door, her hands finding the cool, smooth pearl handle of the pistol she now kept tucked in her apron waistband. She raised the weapon with both hands, just as Weston had taught her. Her arms braced against the recoil. The door buckled again under a coordinated assault, the wood splintering inward. They would be through in another blow. She aimed at the center of the door, at the spot where a man's chest would be. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion inside the confined space was cataclysmic. The lantern flame jumped, and the roar of the shot echoed in her ears. A strangled cry of pain and surprise came from the other side of the door, followed by a string of curses. The assault stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, Mary could hear her own ragged breathing and the frantic drumming of her heart. Then, another sound, a single, clean rifle shot that cracked through the twilight from the direction of the woods. It was immediately followed by a man's scream, a sound that was cut short with a wet, gurgling finality. Mary scrambled to the side window, peering out into the deep shadows. She saw figures moving in the darkness, disorganized, panicked. Another rifle shot rang out, and a second man spun around and fell, clutching his leg. A third, the large, bearded man from the first visit, was frantically trying to drag a fourth, motionless figure back towards the trees and their horses. Then Weston emerged from the tree line, a ghost of vengeance in the fading light. He wasn't rushing. He moved with a cold, lethal grace, his rifle held at the ready. He was not a rancher anymore. He was a warrior defending his territory. The two remaining conscious intruders saw him. The bearded man dropped his fallen comrade. his face a mask of terror. He and the man with the wounded leg scrambled onto their horses and fled into the night, disappearing like frightened deer into the vast wilderness. Weston didn't fire again. He stood over the two men on the ground. One was clearly dead. The other, the one Mary had shot through the door, was writhing, clutching a bloody hole in his shoulder. Weston nudged the dead man with his boot, then turned his attention to the wounded one. He knelt, his movements economical, and ripped the man's sleeve to check the wound. "It'll fester, but you'll live," Weston said, his voice devoid of any pity. "Long enough to take a message back to Harrison Blackwood." He leaned in close, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "Tell him this is his one and only warning. Tell him the next men he sends, I'll bury where they fall. Tell him my home is not for sale and my family is not for hire." He stood up, leaving the man groaning in the dirt. He walked toward the cabin, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his silhouette framed by the lamplight spilling from the doorway. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Mary. He scanned her from head to toe, a frantic search for any injury. She was still standing by the window, the pistol hanging limply in her hand. Now that the danger had passed, a violent tremor took hold of her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the gun. Her teeth chattered. The enormity of what had just happened, of what she had done, crashed down on her. She had shot a man. She had meant to shoot him. Weston crossed the room in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He gently took the pistol from her trembling fingers and set it on the table. He looked at the splintered door, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air, and then back at her pale, shocked face. He saw not a fragile woman, but a survivor who had held the line. He reached out, his intention perhaps only to steady her. But the moment his hands touched her arms, she collapsed against him. She buried her face in his chest, and her shaking turned into ragged, silent sobs. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. It was not an embrace of passion, but something far more elemental. It was the desperate, clinging hold of 2 people who had just walked through fire together and come out the other side. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, the rough wool of his shirt scratching her skin, his heart thudding a steady, reassuring rhythm against her ear. In the ruins of their violated sanctuary, surrounded by the scent of blood and gunpowder, they held each other, 2 solitary souls forging a new, unspoken alliance. The next morning, Weston rode down to Border Ridge, leaving Mary with the rifle and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Tom Burns looked up from his paperwork as Weston entered, his face grim. "Trouble. Grady." "Some men tried to break into my cabin last night," Weston said, his voice flat. "We defended ourselves." Burns leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp. "We?" "My cousin and I," Weston confirmed. "One of them isn't going to be riding again. The others took him, along with another one who's carrying some of my lead. I left the dead one where he fell. He's up by my north pasture." The sheriff was silent for a long moment, steepling his fingers under his chin. He was piecing it together, the bounty hunters, the rumors, Weston's stony demeanor. "And your cousin, Miss Thompson," he asked carefully. "She's all right." "She is," Weston said. "She's also the one who shot the first man through the door before he could break it down." Burns nodded slowly. He stood up and buckled on his gun belt. "All right, Weston, let's go take a look." They rode up to the ranch in silence. Burns examined the scene with a professional eye, the splintered door, the dark, rust-colored stain on the ground, the dead man lying where Weston had left him. He then stepped inside the cabin. Mary was sitting at the table, pale but composed. The pistol was cleaned and resting on the mantelpiece. The sheriff removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "can you tell me what happened?" Mary looked him straight in the eye, her voice clear and steady. "They tried to break down the door. Sheriff, I was alone. I was afraid they were going to kill me. So I shot." Burns looked at the hole in the door, then back at her. He saw the truth in her eyes, and the steel behind it. He saw a woman who had been pushed too far. He turned to Weston. "You get that door fixed. I'll send the undertaker up for this." He gestured vaguely toward the body outside. "And the report?" Weston asked. Sheriff Burns put his hat back on. "The report will say that 3 armed men, known associates of a bounty hunter who passed through my town, attempted to force entry into your home. It will say they were met with armed resistance from the occupants. It will say it was a clear case of self-defense." He walked to the door and paused. "As far as I'm concerned, a man's home is his castle. Grady, that's a law even a federal marshal understands. You and your cousin, you just be careful. This ain't likely to be the end of it." That night, the boards over the broken door were a stark reminder of their new reality. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger one loomed, as vast and cold as the coming winter. They sat by the fire, the silence between them different now. It was no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, shared understanding. They were closer than they had ever been, bound by the violence they had survived. Yet, an invisible line still remained. They had defended a home together, but they had not yet spoken of the feelings that were beginning to build within its walls. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. It was the first true wind of winter, and it carried a promise of the snows to come and the storm that was still gathering in the east. The first sign of the blizzard was a sky the color of a fresh bruise. For a day, it hung over the mountains, a sullen, silent threat. The wind turned sharp and spiteful, carrying a scent of ice from the high peaks. The world grew quiet, the birds silent, the squirrels vanished. Weston worked with a controlled urgency, securing the barn, checking the seals on the windows, and hauling in enough firewood to withstand a siege. Mary helped, her movements mirroring his, a silent, efficient dance against the coming storm. The last visitor before the world disappeared was the circuit mail rider, his face raw from the wind, his horse blowing steam. He delivered a small bundle of supplies and a single, dreaded letter, its expensive Eastern parchment looking impossibly clean against his rough leather glove. He didn't stay, casting a worried eye at the sky before hurrying back down the mountain. The letter lay on the table, a final venomous dart from the world they were about to be cut off from. It was from Harrison's lawyers this time, cold, formal language detailing the court orders he had secured. He now had the legal authority to claim his betrothed, Mary Catherine Whitmore, and federal marshals would be dispatched to enforce the order. It was no longer a threat. It was a declaration of war. Then the snow began, not as gentle flakes, but as a furious, horizontal onslaught, a white curtain that dropped over the landscape, erasing the trees, the barn, the very trail itself. The wind rose to a primal scream, a physical force that battered the cabin walls and rattled the windows in their frames. Within an hour, they were utterly and completely isolated, adrift in a roaring ocean of white. They were trapped in their own pocket of time. For 2 days, the storm raged. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, the steady warmth of the hearth, and the howl of the wind outside. They moved around each other in the confined space, a quiet rhythm of survival. They ate, kept the fire fed, and listened to the blizzard try to tear their sanctuary apart. The constant, overwhelming roar of the storm stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only the raw, undeniable fact of their presence in each other's lives. The threat in the letter felt like a dispatch from another planet. The only reality was the fire, the howling wind, and the person sitting across from you. On the evening of the second day, the intensity of the wind began to lessen. Though the snow still fell thick and heavy, the letter was still on the table between them. "We make it real," Weston said, his voice low but clear over the wind's moan. He was looking at the letter, but speaking to her. Mary looked up from the socks she was darning. "Make what real? The name, the marriage." He finally met her eyes, his gaze steady and serious. "When this breaks, we ride to the county seat. We find a preacher, and I make you Mrs. Weston Grady. Not as a lie, not as a shield, but as a fact. A legal fact. There's no court in this country that will take a man's wife from his home and hand her to another. It's the only way." It was a proposal born of desperation and strategy. A move in a deadly game. It was practical. It was sensible. And it lodged in Mary's heart like a shard of ice. She could not do it. She could not chain him to a lie, to a ghost named Thompson. If she was to be his wife, it would be as herself, with all the danger that entailed. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the cabin was filled with flickering shadows, she made her choice. The storm was their confessional, a roaring privacy that allowed for no more secrets. "Weston?" she said softly. He looked at her, his face weary in the dim light. "If I am to do this, if I am to be your wife, you will not marry Mary Thompson." She took a deep breath, the last breath of her old life, and let it go. "My name is Mary Catherine Whitmore. My father is a merchant in Baltimore. He is a man who values ledgers more than his own daughter's happiness. Harrison Blackwood is his business partner. To them, our marriage was a merger, and I was an asset to be transferred." She told him everything then. Not just the story of a cage, but the details of its construction. The way Harrison's affection was a form of control, his compliments a way of shaping her, his anger a tool to punish any sign of an independent will. She told Weston of her fear, yes, but also of her suffocating loneliness in a world that saw her as a beautiful object to be possessed. By the time she finished, her voice was raw, and tears she hadn't realized she was crying traced cold paths down her cheeks. She had laid her entire, broken truth at his feet. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the glowing coals. The only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. She waited, her heart aching with a terrible vulnerability. He reached across the space between them and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. He didn't pull away. He cupped her face in his hand, his touch surprisingly tender. "Mary Catherine Whitmore." He said, the name a solemn vow on his lips. "It's a good, strong name." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw no judgment, no hesitation, only a deep, unwavering certainty. "I don't give a damn what your name is. I don't care if the entire United States Army comes looking for you. I choose you." His words were the key that unlocked the final door inside her. The fear, the shame, the loneliness, it all fell away, consumed by the warmth of the fire and the strength in his gaze. He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that was not about desperation or strategy, but about profound and absolute acceptance. The storm outside raged, a wild and untamed symphony, but inside the cabin, a deep and profound quiet settled between them. The kiss deepened, and the walls they had so carefully maintained around their hearts dissolved into nothing. This was a new frontier, more terrifying and beautiful than any mountain pass. It was the landscape of intimacy, and she was afraid of getting lost. He drew back slightly, seeing the flicker of fear that crossed her face. It was the ghost of Harrison, the fear of being possessed, of being an object for another's satisfaction. She was trembling, a mix of desire and a lifetime of conditioned fear. She leaned her forehead against his, her voice a ragged whisper, a plea dragged up from the depths of her past. "Don't make me scream." It was the voice of a girl who had been taught that a man's pleasure could be her pain. Weston heard it and understood it completely. A gentle smile touched his lips, a smile of pure reassurance that reached all the way to his soul-weary eyes. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her temple. "You'll scream sweet, Mary Catherine," he murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Only if you want, and only for yourself." His promise was an absolution. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. He wasn't taking, he was offering. He was giving her back the ownership of her own body, her own pleasure. It was the ultimate act of freedom. With a small, trusting sigh, she gave herself over to the moment, not as an act of surrender, but as a declaration of her own sovereign will. They came together not in a frenzy of passion, but with a sense of reverent discovery. It was a sacrament of survival, a quiet, fervent prayer against the storm, as the blizzard howled its fury at the world, trying to tear their little shelter from the mountainside. They found the calm, unshakable center of the storm in each other's arms. Mary awoke to a world transformed. The storm had passed. A profound, pristine silence had fallen, broken only by the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves. Sunlight, brilliant and dazzling, poured through the window, reflecting off the boundless expanse of white. The world had been wiped clean, a blank page waiting for a new story. She was nestled in Weston's arms, her head on his chest, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm beneath her ear. There was no shame, no regret, only a deep and abiding sense of peace. They were no longer two separate, wounded people hiding from the world. They were a unit, a partnership forged in fire and ice. He stirred, his arm tightening around her. He opened his eyes, and when he saw her looking at him, he smiled. It was a real smile this time, one that lit his face and chased the last of the shadows from his eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Grady," he said softly. "Not yet," she whispered back, a smile of her own blooming on her face. "Soon," he promised. "Soon as this snow melts enough to get a horse down the trail, we're going to make it official." It was no longer a strategy. It was a joyful certainty, a new beginning. Later, after they had dressed and rekindled the fire, Weston stood by the window, sipping a cup of coffee and looking out at the new world. The snow was deep, easily 4 or 5 feet, but the sun was bright and the melt had already begun. "It'll be a few days, but the south-facing trail should clear first," he said, thinking aloud. He squinted, his gaze fixed on a distant point down the valley where the trail first became visible. His posture stiffened. "What is it?" Mary asked, coming to stand beside him. He didn't answer for a moment. He just pointed, following his gesture. She saw them, a line of dark figures, tiny against the vast backdrop of white. They were moving slowly, laboriously, through the deep snow, their horses struggling, but they were moving steadily upward. It wasn't 1 or 2 riders. It was a column, at least half a dozen of them. Even from this distance, 2 figures stood out. One at the lead, a large man on a powerful horse, whose bearing screamed of wealth and unshakable authority. And another beside him, older, slighter, bundled against the cold, but with a familiar, defeated slump to his shoulders. Harrison Blackwood and her father. The blizzard had trapped them, given them a small, perfect pocket of time to find each other. But it had also given their enemies time to gather their forces and begin the final, inexorable assault. The storm was over, but the war had just arrived at their door. The serenity of the snow-covered world was a cruel joke. Inside the cabin, the beauty had been replaced by the grim reality of preparation. The brilliant sunlight streaming through the windows now served only to illuminate the dust motes stirred by their hurried movements. They were no longer lovers waking to a new world, but soldiers digging in for a final stand. Weston worked with a chilling efficiency. He and Mary dragged the heavy wooden table to barricade the main door, leaving only the reinforced and smaller back door as a sally port. He loaded every firearm. He owned his rifle, his Colt, Maggie's pistol, and an old, heavy shotgun, and placed them at strategic windows. Mary, following his lead, filled every bucket and pot with water, both for drinking and for fighting the fires she knew were coming. There was no panic, no wasted motion. A grim resolve had settled over them, a shared understanding that this was the last line. There was no more running. By mid-morning, the riders had reached the edge of the clearing. There were 8 of them. 6 were hard cases, the kind of men whose loyalty was sold by the day and whose morals were etched in the bottom of a bottle. They fanned out, taking cover behind the corral and the thick trunks of the ponderosa pines, their movements professional and menacing. 2 men remained mounted in the center of the clearing, Harrison Blackwood, his expensive eastern coat a stark black slash against the snow, and beside him, a smaller, older man, hunched in his saddle, his face pale and pinched with cold and misery. Mary's father. One of the hired guns, a man with a tin star pinned to his coat to give the illusion of authority, walked forward into the open, a roll of paper in his hand. "Weston Grady," he shouted, his voice unnaturally loud in the pristine silence. "I have a federal warrant here for the arrest of one Mary Catherine Whitmore, a fugitive from justice. We are here to escort her back to Baltimore to face charges. Comply, and you will not be harmed." Weston appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his Winchester held loosely in one hand. "You're standing on private property," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried with more authority than the hired man's shout. "And you're waving a piece of paper that isn't worth the ink it's printed with. I suggest you leave." "This is a lawful action," the man with the star insisted, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "There's nothing lawful about trying to steal a man's family," Weston countered. "This is your only warning. Turn around and ride away." For a moment, a tense tableau held. The hired guns looked to Harrison. Harrison, his face a mask of arrogant fury, gave a sharp, angry nod. The man with the star drew his pistol. "Last chance, Grady." The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Weston fired the Winchester from his hip, the bullet thudding into the snowbank near the man's feet, sending him scrambling for cover. Weston ducked back inside as a hail of bullets splintered the doorframe where he had just been standing. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of smoke, noise, and fear. The hired guns laid down a steady, covering fire, their bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Weston moved from window to window, never firing twice from the same spot, his shots measured and precise. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was trying to hold them back, to make the cost of advancing too high. Then, as they had feared, came the fire. One of the men darted from behind the barn, a lit torch in his hand. He flung it in a high arc, and it landed on the dry roof of the small woodshed. The tinder-dry shingles caught instantly, flames licking up toward the gray sky, thick black smoke billowing into the clean mountain air. It was a tactic to divide their attention, to create chaos. "Mary!" the west window, Weston yelled over the din. Mary was already there. Her initial heart-stopping fear had been burned away by the heat of battle, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She rested the barrel of Maggie's pistol on the barricaded sill. She saw 2 of the hired men using the smoke from the burning shed as cover to move around the side of the cabin, to flank them. She remembered Weston's lessons, *breathe out slow. Squeeze, don't pull *. She aimed at the ground in front of the lead man and fired. The bullet kicked up a spray of snow and dirt, forcing him to dive for cover. She fired again, pinning them down. She was not a victim. She was a defender. She was holding a flank. The steadfast, disciplined defense began to take its toll on the attackers. This was not the easy job they had been promised. They were fighting a ghost who shot with deadly accuracy and a woman who had found her courage. One of them was already down, clutching a shattered arm. Another had a bullet graze across his cheek. The easy money was beginning to look like a funeral fee. Enraged by the incompetence of his men, Harrison Blackwood finally lost his patience. He strode out from behind the relative safety of the corral, his face purple with fury, heedless of the danger. "Catherine!" he bellowed, his voice filled with a lifetime of command and condescension. "Stop this absurd rebellion at once. This backwoods savage has poisoned your mind with his peasant notions. You are a Whitmore. You are my fiancée. You will do as you are told." He turned his tirade on her father. "William, Control your daughter." Mary's father just stared, a statue of impotence. But Mary answered. She moved from the window to the shattered front door, her voice ringing out over the chaos, clear and strong and utterly transformed. "My name is Mary," she shouted back, her voice not pleading but commanding. "And I am not your property, Harrison. I am not yours. I am not my father's. I am no one's but my own." She looked past Harrison, her eyes finding the miserable figure of her father. "Is this what you wanted for me? Father, a battleground, is this the security you promised?" Her words struck a deeper blow than any bullet. Her father physically flinched, his face crumpling. Harrison was momentarily stunned into silence by her defiance. The hired guns paused, looking at each other. This was more than they had signed up for. Sensing the shift, Harrison made his final, fatal error. His authority was collapsing, his prize defying him. Arrogance and rage consumed him. With a guttural roar, he charged toward the cabin, his intention clear to drag her out himself, to physically overpower her and reclaim what he believed was his. Weston raised his rifle, but one of the hired guns pinned him down with a renewed burst of fire. Harrison was almost to the door, his face a mask of twisted ownership, his hands reaching for her. He had forgotten one thing. Mary was no longer the girl who trembled at his anger. From the folds of her apron, she produced a small, two-shot Derringer, a weapon Weston had given her for close quarters, a final, desperate line of defense. As Harrison lunged across the threshold, she raised it, looked him dead in the eye, and fired. The sound was small compared to the rifles. A flat, ugly pop. A neat, dark circle appeared on the pristine white of Harrison's shirt. High on his chest, a look of profound, absolute surprise crossed his face. He stumbled backward, his hands going to his chest, and then he fell into the snow, his expensive coat turning dark with his life's blood. A stunned silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the burning woodshed. Harrison's fall had broken the siege. The hired guns stared at the body of their employer, then at the woman in the doorway holding a smoking pistol. Their fight was over. Their paymaster was dead. Into this silence rode Sheriff Tom Burns and 3 deputies, drawn by the sound of a full-scale gun battle. They took in the scene at a glance: the body in the snow, the burning shed, the bullet-riddled cabin, the demoralized hired guns. "Drop your weapons," Burns commanded, his voice the unequivocal sound of the law. "All of you." The hired guns complied immediately, their relief palpable. Sheriff Burns dismounted and walked over to the man with the tin star, plucking the fraudulent warrant from his hand. He glanced at it, his lip curling in a sneer. "A forgery," he declared loudly. "For all to hear, the seal is wrong, and Judge Abernathy in Denver would never sign something this sloppy." He looked at the hired guns. "You men were party to an illegal armed action. You're all under arrest." He then walked over to Mary and Weston, his gaze falling on Harrison's body, then on the Derringer still in Mary's hand. He looked at her face, saw the shock, but also the unyielding resolve. "He tried to force his way in," Weston said quietly. She defended herself. Burns nodded slowly. "My report will show that Mr. Blackwood was killed while committing a felonious assault. It was self-defense. Justifiable." He turned to his deputies. "Get this fire out and get these men ready for transport. Somebody send for the undertaker. Again." The aftermath was a quiet, somber affair. The fire was extinguished, leaving a blackened, smoking ruin. The hired guns were disarmed and marched down the mountain. As the deputies prepared to move Harrison's body, Mary looked across the clearing at her father. He stood alone, a frail, broken figure in the vast, blood-stained snow. All his plans, all his ambitions, lay dead at his feet. He finally raised his head and looked at his daughter. He saw not the obedient child he had tried to sell, but a stranger, a formidable woman who had faced down death and won. He saw the chasm between them, a gulf too wide to ever be crossed. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. With a look of utter, final defeat, William Whitmore turned his back on his daughter. He walked to his horse, mounted with the slow, stiff movements of an old man, and rode away, never once looking back. The last of the hired guns was led away. The deputies followed. The forest fell silent. The only sound, the soft drip of melting snow. The battle was over. A chapter of her life, written in fear and obedience, had just been burned to ash. The silence that followed the violence was more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, of snow absorbing the echoes of gunfire, of a chapter slammed shut. In the days that followed, the cabin became a place of quiet, deliberate mending. The work was a balm, a way to reclaim their home from the violation it had suffered. Weston, with the patient skill of a craftsman, planed new pine boards to repair the splintered door. The rasp of the tool was a steady, rhythmic sound, a counterpoint to the memory of chaos. He worked the wood until it was smooth, fitting the new planks so perfectly that the seam was almost invisible. It was stronger than it had been before. Mary took on the task of replacing the shattered window pane. Weston had brought back a new sheet of glass from town, and she carefully scraped out the old, jagged shards and set the new pane in a bed of fresh putty. As she smoothed the putty with her finger, she looked through the clear glass at the snow-blanketed world outside. The window was no longer a vulnerability, a place where a threat could enter, but a frame for their future. Their home now wore its scars openly. The log walls were pocked with the dark, round mouths of bullet holes, which Weston plugged with dowels and pitch. The repaired door, the new window, the blackened patch of ground where the woodshed had stood, they were all testament to the battle they had won. The house was like a person who had survived a terrible wound. It was whole again, but the memory of the trauma was written into its very skin. And like the house, they too were healing. The spaces between them filled not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable strength. Harrison Blackwood was buried in a simple pine box in the corner of Border Ridge's small, wind-swept cemetery. The county paid for the plot and the undertaker. There was no eulogy, no mourners from the east, no testament to his wealth or power. He was just another man who had met a violent end on the frontier, his ambition turning to dust under a vast, indifferent Colorado sky. Mary did not attend. She felt no triumph, no hatred, only a profound and final sense of release. She stood at the cabin window, looking down the valley toward the town, and as the sun set on the day of his burial, she closed a door in her mind and did not look back. Their first trip to town together, a week after the siege, was a test. Mary felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as they rode down the mountain trail. She expected the same hostile stares, the whispered judgments, but Border Ridge had been changed by the story of the gunfight. The tale had spread like wildfire, losing none of its drama in the telling. They were no longer just the reclusive rancher and his mysterious woman. They were the couple who had stood their ground against 8 hired guns and won. As they walked down the main street toward Henderson's Mercantile, men who had once looked through her now tipped their hats. Mr. Grady, ma'am. The respect was grudging in some, but it was there. Mr. Henderson himself came from behind the counter to greet them, his demeanor entirely transformed. Whatever you need. Grady, it's yours. A pleasure to see you. Miss Thompson. The most surprising encounter came from the Dusty Spur Saloon. A large woman with a cascade of red hair and a world-weary but kind face stepped out onto the boardwalk. It was Big Sally, the saloon's proprietor. She looked Mary up and down, a slow, appraising gaze. "So you're the one," she said, her voice a husky baritone. "Heard you can handle a pistol better than most of the fools who drink in my establishment." She broke into a wide, genuine grin. Any woman who can make Harrison Blackwood regret his life choices is a friend of mine. Welcome to Border Ridge. Honey. Later, as Weston was loading supplies, a woman in a neat calico dress approached Mary. It was Mrs. Burns, the sheriff's wife, Miss Thompson, she said with a warm smile. My Tom has told me so much about your, fortitude. I'm hosting a quilting circle on Thursday. I'd be honored if you would join us. It was an invitation into the heart of the community, an acceptance offered by the very women who set the town's social standards. Mary felt tears prick her eyes. I'd like that very much. Mrs. Burns, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She was no longer an outsider to be judged, but a neighbor to be welcomed. Back at the ranch, the mending continued. While clearing the charred rubble of the woodshed to prepare for rebuilding, Weston's shovel struck something hard and metallic beneath the foundation stones. Curious, he dug around it, finally prying loose a small, rust-pitted tin box. It was heavy. He brought it into the cabin and set it on the table between them. With a wedge and a hammer, he broke the rusted seal. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were Maggie's treasures. There was a small pouch of Gold Eagle coins, a surprising amount of money carefully saved. There was a folded, yellowed deed for a 40-acre parcel of land adjoining their own. The Murphy place, a spring-fed meadow Weston had long coveted but could never afford. And, at the very bottom, there was a letter, sealed with wax that had crumbled with age. The envelope simply said, "For my Weston." His hands trembled as he opened it. Mary moved to stand behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders as he read the delicate, familiar handwriting aloud. Asterisk, my dearest Weston. Asterisk, if you are reading this, then my time on this mountain has come to an end, and my greatest fear has come to pass that I have left you alone. Do not let sorrow be your only companion. Do not let our home become a tomb filled with my memory. The fire in our hearth is meant for warmth, not for ghosts. I beg of you, live, truly live. Asterisk, find a good woman, a strong woman who loves this land as I did. Let her laughter fill these rooms again. Let her plant a new garden. Do not think of it as a betrayal, my love. Think of it as a promise you are keeping for me. Love again. Live again. For me. But most of all, for yourself. Asterisk, yours forever. Maggie. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Weston's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He reached up and covered Mary's hand with his own. The letter was not a ghost's curse, but a blessing. It was permission, an absolution he never knew he needed. It was Maggie, giving him back his future. That evening, they sat by the fire, the deed and the letter on the mantelpiece, the coins stacked neatly on the table. A settlement had been reached, brokered by Sheriff Burns and a traveling judge. Harrison Blackwood's accounts and assets that he had brought west to fund his private war were ruled to have been used in the commission of a crime. They were forfeit, to be paid as restitution to the Grady Ranch for damages. The sum was substantial. Suddenly, they were not just surviving. They were solvent. They had land. They had capital. They had a future that was more than just the changing of the seasons. We can expand the herd, Weston said, his voice filled with a quiet awe, with the Murphy Meadow. We'll have the best pasture in the county. You could build a real school, Mary said, her eyes shining with an idea. Not just a room in the church, a proper schoolhouse. For the children on the outlying ranches. They have no one to teach them to read or write. She looked at him, her Eastern past and her Western present merging into a single, clear vision. We could give them a chance, Weston, a real chance. He looked at her, at the passion and intelligence in her face, and he saw not just the woman he loved, but the partner he had found, a woman who looked at a pile of money and saw not cattle, but children's futures. A school, he said, tasting the word. He smiled. The Grady School. I like the sound of that. In the weeks that followed, A new and joyful purpose settled over the ranch. Plans were drawn. Lumber was ordered. The scars on the cabin began to fade into the background. No longer reminders of a battle, but simply part of the history of their home. The healing was no longer a conscious effort. It was simply the rhythm of their life together. One crisp autumn morning, as Mary was kneading dough for bread, a strange wave of dizziness washed over her. She braced herself against the table, the feeling passing as quickly as it came. It had happened before, this past week, a sudden weariness, a queasiness in the morning. She stopped her work, her hands still covered in flour, and a slow, dawning realization spread through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She counted the weeks in her head, her heart beginning to beat a rapid, hopeful tattoo against her ribs. When Weston came in for lunch, she was sitting in the rocking chair, her hands resting on her stomach, a small, secret smile on her face. He knew instantly that something was different. "Mary," he asked, his voice full of concern, "are you all right?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a light he had never seen before. "More than all right, Weston," she said softly. "We're going to need another room. For the schoolmarm's baby." Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. A wide grin split his face, and he let out a whoop of laughter that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. He rushed to her, kneeling in front of the chair and gathering her in his arms. He was laughing and kissing her face, her hair, her hands. But then, as he held her, a shadow passed through his eyes. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The memory, the ghost of a small boy with his mother's eyes. A ghost that had been sleeping, stirred in its shallow grave. The joy was still there, fierce and bright, but it was now laced with the cold, sharp edge of a terror he had never truly vanquished, the fear of losing it all again. He pulled her tighter, his embrace becoming one of fierce, desperate protection. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the tremor that ran through his powerful frame. He was both overjoyed and terrified, a man standing at the confluence of his greatest happiness and his deepest pain. The past was not gone, but the future, fragile and precious, was growing within her. The fear that had gripped Weston in the moment of his greatest joy was a ghost he had to learn to live with. It did not vanish, but Mary's quiet strength, her unwavering belief in their future, taught him how to walk alongside it. She did not dismiss his fear, but met it with a love so profound it left no room for the shadows of the past to take root. His terror for her safety during her pregnancy was fierce, but it was the terror of a man who had everything to lose, and it made him more attentive, more tender than he had ever been. The first snows of that winter held off, granting them a long, golden autumn. It was during this reprieve, on a crisp October afternoon with the aspen trees blazing like 1,000 fires on the mountainside, that they were married. There was no fine church, no crowd of well-wishers. The ceremony took place on the porch of the cabin, the very spot where Mary had once stood, a terrified stranger in a land of red dust. Sheriff Tom Burns stood before them, his Bible open in his sun-weathered hands, his wife Sarah at his side as the sole witness. Mary wore a simple dress of deep blue calico she had sewn herself, and in her hair she wore a sprig of late-blooming mountain aster. Weston wore a clean shirt and a look of such reverent awe it made Mary's heart ache with love. They didn't speak long, flowery vows. Their promises were simple, forged in the reality of the life they had already built. He promised to be her home. She promised to be his peace. When the sheriff pronounced them man and wife, Weston Grady kissed his bride, Mary Catherine Grady, not with the desperate relief of a survivor, but with the deep, quiet joy of a man who had finally, truly, come home. Sarah Burns had baked a cake. It was a simple, rustic thing, a honey and spice cake made with the last of the season's Saskatoon berries. As they shared it on the porch, a small circle of 4 people against the vastness of the mountains, Mary thought of Maggie, the woman who had first preserved those berries. She felt not a shadow of jealousy, but a sense of profound connection, a gratitude for the love that had built this home and the blessing that had allowed it to be reborn. With the coming of spring, the sounds of hammers and saws joined the birdsong on the mountain, on the corner of the newly acquired Murphy Meadow, where a clear spring bubbled up from the ground. The Grady School began to take shape. Weston, along with 2 hired hands from a neighboring ranch, raised the walls. It was a simple, one-room structure, but it was built with the same care and solidity as their own cabin, with large windows to let in the light. Before the walls were even finished, the students began to arrive. They were the children of ranchers and homesteaders, shy, freckle-faced boys and girls with rough hands and curious eyes who rode for miles on horseback. Mary was their teacher. She held classes under the shade of a great ponderosa pine, her students sitting on upturned logs. She had no fine primers or slates from the east. She taught them their letters using charcoal sticks on smooth, flat stones. She watched as a young boy, whose hands were calloused from mending fences, painstakingly formed the letters of his own name for the first time. She saw the flash of understanding in a young girl's eyes as she grasped the magic of turning those letters into words. This was a different kind of building. This was the laying of a foundation for a future none of them could yet imagine. It was a legacy of hope, built with ink and ideas. As Mary's belly grew, another room in the cabin was being transformed. The spare room, the one that had for so long been a shrine to Maggie, was being reborn. Mary carefully packed away the silver-backed brush and the quilt, storing them with loving care in the cedar chest. This was not an act of erasure, but one of honor. Maggie's memory would always be a part of the house, but this room now belonged to the future. One afternoon, Weston brought the old cradle down from the loft. It was the one he had built for Sam. It was covered in dust, the wood dark with age and memory. He stood for a long time, just looking at it, his face a mixture of love and old, deep pain. Mary came and stood beside him, placing her hand on his arm. "He would have loved being a big brother," she said softly. Weston nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He ran his hand over the smooth, worn wood of the cradle's rocker. "I made it from the wood of an aspen that grew right over there," he said, his voice thick. "Maggie said it was a wishing tree." For the next week, he worked on the cradle. He didn't discard it. He sanded it down with gentle, loving strokes, stripping away the old varnish of grief, revealing the beautiful, pale wood beneath. He smoothed every edge, checked every joint. It was an act of quiet ceremony, a conversation with his past. He was making the cradle new again, not to replace the son he had lost, but to welcome the child they had been given. He was making room for a new life, alongside the memory of the old one. When he was finished, the cradle shone in the sunlight, a bridge between memory and hope. The first snow of that winter came early, a surprise storm that swept down from the peaks in late November. It was not a blizzard, but a gentle, determined fall of thick, white flakes that quickly blanketed the world in a pristine silence. And it was on that night, with the snow falling softly outside the new window pane, that Mary's labor began. Sarah Burns arrived on horseback, her face ruddy from the cold, her bag full of herbs and clean linens. Weston was a wreck. He paced the main room like a caged animal, his fear a palpable presence. Every pained cry from the bedroom was a knife in his heart, a terrifying echo of a past he could not outrun. He was reliving his worst nightmare, the feeling of being helpless while the person he loved most in the world was in peril. It was Sarah who finally came out and grabbed him by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Weston Grady, you are no good to anyone out here wearing a path in the floorboards. She needs you. Now you get in there and hold her hand and be the husband she deserves." He went. He saw the sweat on Mary's brow, the exhaustion and pain in her eyes. But he also saw a strength that dwarfed his fear. She was a warrior, fighting the oldest and most profound battle in the world. He took her hand, and in her grip, he found his own courage. He was her anchor through the long, difficult hours, his voice a low, steady murmur of love and encouragement. Just before dawn, as the snow outside softened to a gentle flurry, a new sound filled the cabin, a thin, reedy, but powerful cry. A new life, asserting its presence in the world. Sarah cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft blanket. "You have a daughter, Weston," she said, her voice warm with joyful tears. "A beautiful, healthy daughter." She placed the baby in Mary's arms. Mary looked down at the tiny, perfect face, the little tuft of dark hair, and a wave of love so fierce and overwhelming washed over her. It left her breathless. Weston knelt beside the bed, his face a study in wonder. He reached out a trembling finger and stroked the baby's soft cheek. All the fear, all the ghosts, all the sorrows of his past were burned away in the fiery, all-consuming love for this new, tiny person. "What will we name her?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Mary looked at him, her eyes full of love for this man, for their child, for the improbable, miraculous life they had built. "Grace," she said softly. "Her name is Grace." A few weeks later, the world was a wonderland of deep snow and brilliant sunshine. The school was closed for the winter. The cabin was warm and cozy, and the cradle held its precious new occupant. One afternoon, Weston stepped out onto the porch with a hammer and a newly carved piece of wood. It was a long plank of polished pine, and burned into its surface in bold, clear letters were 2 words, asterisk, asterisk. The Grady's asterisk, asterisk. He hung the sign on the main beam above the porch. It swung slightly in the breeze, a declaration, a flag planted on their own small piece of the world. Mary came out, holding a sleeping Grace bundled in blankets, and stood beside him. She slipped her arm through his, and they stood together, looking at their home. A gentle snow began to fall, the flakes dusting their shoulders, the world of red dust, of fear and flight, of bounty hunters and broken promises, seemed a lifetime away, a story that had happened to someone else. Mary leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the cold, clean air and the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine. She looked at the sign, at the solid log walls of the cabin, at the man standing beside her, and at the child in her arms. Everything she had ever searched for was right here. "Home," she whispered, the word a quiet prayer of gratitude. Weston tightened his arm around her, pulling her and their daughter closer. He looked out at the mountains that had given them sanctuary, his heart full to bursting. "Forever," he answered. "Thank you so much for joining us for this story here on Wild West Night. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. It's always a pleasure to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed the story of Mary and Weston, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, and if you'd really like to support us, hitting that hype button. It helps more than you know and allows these stories to be heard by more people. We'll see you next time with another tale from the frontier.